We Catholic homeschoolers are all about book lists. But where is the list with the warning labels? Author, instructor, and homeschooling mom Eleanor Bourg Nicholson is here to share the books your children should never, ever read.
Welcome to Homeschooling Saints, the podcast that helps you create the homeschool you love for the people you love. Our host is Lisa Mladinich, a Catholic life coach, TV host, best-selling author, and an instructor at Homeschool Connections.
Before we get started, remember to subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you're watching on YouTube, click the bell to join our channel. Hello and welcome. I'm Lisa Mladinich, and our guest today is the wonderful Eleanor Bourg Nicholson, here to talk about the books your children should never, ever read. Eleanor Bourg Nicholson, the resident Victorian literature instructor at Homeschool Connections, is herself a graduated homeschooler and a homeschooling mother of many. In addition to scholarly pursuits and child rearing, she occasionally strays into fiction, including her epistolary novella, The Letters of Magdalen Montague, and her Gothic novels, A Bloody Habit, Brother Wolf, and Wake of Malice. A former assistant executive editor for Dappled Things, she is an assistant editor for the St. Austin Review, as well as the editor of several Ignatius critical editions of the classics, and has collaborated with other editors to provide footnotes for numerous other works. By night, she reads the Victorians, writes Gothic novels, and cares for small children. And you can contact Eleanor at her website, eleanorbourgnicholson.com. That's in the show notes, but it's Eleanor, just the way it sounds, Bourg, B-O-U-R-G, Nicholson with two O's, Nicholson.com. Anyway, good to see you, Eleanor. It's great to have you back.
Thank you for having me again, Lisa. It's always fun.
Oh, yeah, we do always have fun. So you've proposed this topic, and it's rather ominous, but I have a feeling, because I know you pretty well, that it's a little tongue-in-cheek, or are we actually getting ready to build a bonfire here?
Well, I'm not opposed to the destruction of some books that deserve to be destroyed. We can even talk about the times when I have destroyed a book. But no, I'm not here to propose necessarily a list of banned books, although you can certainly find that sort of thing through the Catholic Church and other respectable organizations. But really to propose a theory or a way, a mode of reading, which will help parents help their children be good readers and to read safely and in a virtuous manner.
Yeah, that's very intriguing, to read safely and virtuously. So step us into what's most important to parents as we're starting to consider this idea of what our children should read and how we kind of disseminate this stuff to our kids.
Well, I think we have to make a distinction between ideas that are dangerous, books that are outright dangerous. I mentioned a minute ago that we've actually destroyed books. I recently accidentally received a box of actual witchcraft manuals from my publisher, the printer, not the publisher. The printer was supposed to send copies of my books. And when I opened it, this feels heavier. Found the real deal, how to do it.
Gosh.
Which was very alarming. Contacted the printer and they said, well, dispose of it however you like. We'll send you your books. So my husband and I called a priest and said, how do we dispose of these? And told the children, do not come near these books. Do not watch us as we destroy these books. I don't want words in your heads. I don't want images. We're destroying them and trying not to look, because this is not information we remotely want to enter our heads. This is where curiosity is an intellectual vice, and it's a danger. It's a seductive thing. Oh, how could this hurt me? But no. So, and there are cases where there are books that you should not even open unless you're destroying them, according to an exorcist's recommendations. But really, the heart of my proposal here is that I think that parents need to be informed and engaged with their children as readers. So anytime a child is reading something, read with them, read before them. That's even better. So you're not surprised by the content. And if you have an open conversation with them about everything that they're reading, even if they read something that they say, this bothered me, they will be coming to you to discuss it. This is a little odd. I've even had children come to me and say, they're saying words like stupid, which we're not allowed to say. And I say, well, that's interesting. Who are they calling stupid? what does this tell you about the character? Yes, that's really unfortunate. And then you unpack that. I mean, that's a pretty pedestrian, low stress example. But, they said this. You can never really fully anticipate what a child is going to get from what they read. I learned the facts of life reading the Bible, and it was a shock. It was a shock. It was a huge shock.
We are not recommending burning Bibles.
We are certainly not. But my daughter figured it out by reading Charles Dickens and Agatha Christie. She came to me one day and she said, "Mommy, if a man is married to a woman and then he disappears and she thinks he's dead and she gets married again, but it's not a real marriage because it's bigamous. And then she has a baby. Whose DNA is in the baby and how did it get there?" And I went, "Wow, what?" But a beautiful conversation came from it. But notice she came straight to me. Like, there has to be a mechanism. I was like, well, okay, all right. A beautiful conversation with lots of literary references. She's like, oh, that's why that character behaving that way was unfortunate in that book. So, but I did not expect that was what she was going to take away from it. But I was prepared for the conversation when it came to me because she talks to me. So that really, that open communication and the fact that she wasn't reading a book I hadn't read. Or I cheat sometimes if I'm low on time and I can't read a book that someone's given to us or recommended. I hand it to my mom. Say, read this, vet this for me, Yeah. And then she comes back and says, oh, this is good. Or, oh, this has got some questionable themes you'd have to discuss, but be prepared for them. Or, I don't think this is good for this child.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. How fortunate to have a mom that's so engaged and ready to assist. Because when you're in the thick of, your littles and all the things in life, it can be hard to have any bandwidth to read, let alone read everything.
Yes. And another good example, last year, our second, she was 10 at the time. She came to me and she said, I really want to read The Phantom of the Opera. And I said, I think it'll scare you. 3 weeks of begging. And I thought, well, I've read it before. I said, all right, if you start to get scared, come talk to me. So she spent a Saturday on her bed reading Phantom of the Opera. And I kept checking on her. She was still reading. At the very end, I was in bed with the toddler and she comes in with tears streaming down her face. And I said, oh, baby, I'm so sorry. You shouldn't have read it. And she said, that was such a beautiful book, Mommy. It's about redemption. And she goes on this long thing about it. My eldest could not have read that at 10. She's like me. She's very easily scared. But the second one could. And if she'd been scared, well, I would work through the trauma too. But see, that conversation, and these are not dangerous books, except for the witchcraft manuals. I'm not even talking about dangerous books yet, because there are books that are dangerous. And unfortunately are widely read. They're often pressed in high school, college, on young readers who are not equipped to tangle with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you even made a great comment about that kind of readiness even at the college age where people go off, and you want to touch back into that, and they read certain philosophers before they've read really good philosophy. Would you mind taking us there?
Well, my husband, as you know, is a philosophy professor, and he would say it would drive him crazy. Say they hand these 18-year-olds Nietzsche, and they haven't read Plato, and they haven't read Aristotle, and they haven't read Aquinas, and now they think they have thoughts because they read Nietzsche. And he said, and now you're going to be fighting an ill-formed mind with bad ideas. Mm-hmm. And even if you try, because they've also been indoctrinated with relativism, even if you try to guide them, they'll say, well, there have been lots of different ideas through the ages. Instead of, there is a body of knowledge, and this body of knowledge, there is right, there is wrong. There have been progressively deep understandings of the human condition. And so it also comes from how much your children are reading of good books. I once joked in an interview about one of my books that don't give your daughters Twilight, which I don't recommend reading. It's just deleterious smut, but Jane Austen, because otherwise they're going to be seduced by the idea of the bad boy being sexy. And a mom called in a panic saying, my 13-year-old read Twilight. She's dating a bad boy. What should I do? And I, of course, wanted to say, she's 13. She doesn't need a boyfriend. Well, can you go back and read Jane Austen with her and show her what a virtuous man looks like? But I was in a panic thinking, oh, golly, I shouldn't make smart alecky comments and come back. But that's a good example. It's Twilight. It's very badly written. A worse example would be something like 50 Shades of Grey, which made the rounds. How is that forming a young woman's mind? So things that stray into gratuitous sex, excessive violence, or representations of the occult, any sort of wicked or amoral celebration is just, that becomes dangerous. And sometimes people say, well, it's just fun. A lot of that depends on the formation of the reader. And a really well-formed reader is probably not even going to want to read them.
Right. And as people have pointed out to you, so I want to be just for fun, because we already talked about it a little provocative, and that is that, well, look at the ancients and we read fables and mythology, and C.S. Lewis had witches and occult references in his stories, and lots of the stuff that we consider safe for our kids references certain kinds of things or has certain kinds of creatures or deities. And so how do we approach that topic? Because there's so much fantasy literature out there that's actually quite good.
Yes, absolutely. I had someone recently ask me specifically about the ancient myths. I said, I love the ancient myths. And the response was, yes, but in one of your books, you claimed that the ancient gods were probably demons. I said, well, according to exorcists, they probably were. But I think that raising children to know the myths and to understand the distinction between the stories that man put together to try and explain his reality and how God has revealed himself. My brother would always start out reading the myths to my children, and he would say, before God revealed himself to man, before our Lord, took flesh and walked upon this earth, man concocted stories to try and explain who he was. And these are some of those stories. And my children would still say, is this real or is this a story?
Mm-hmm.
But you can look as far back as Saint Basil the Great, and he wrote an address to young men. And in his address to young men, he said that it was very important for the literary critical formation of the young man to read pagan texts before he attempted to study the scriptures. And he said that you needed to be formed as a reader, and that the ancient texts would teach you that. One of his analogies is you must gaze at the reflection of light in the water before you attempt to gaze at the sun.
Wow.
So,
That's fascinating.
It's a beautiful, beautiful, a very short work. I recommend reading Basil the Great, addressed to young men. But I think it's true. I think it's accurate to how we can read. Notice St. Basil isn't saying, now go out and read something that's demonic or something that's blasphemous or something that's graphic. Although some of those ancient myths they're pretty raunchy. But there is so much beauty and creative wonder there as well. And especially if it's rooted in an understanding of that period, it can be very educational. To say, all right, this is what the ancient Greeks were doing. And this is how they were developing on pure reason without revelation. Isn't that fascinating? So also not reading in a hole or in a dark room, reading things in their rich historical context can be very helpful as well. But, at the college level, there were things that they assigned me in college. There was a day where I actually stood up in class and said, I refuse to continue to read this. It was a piece of graphic gay pornography, which when I started reading, I went, I can't understand what's being described here. And then I realized what was being described.
Oh my gosh.
I was traveling. I was in London. I called my mother and she's like, you're shaking. What on earth happened? I was like, I could hardly speak. I was so enraged. And I said, I object to it on a moral level, but I primarily bring this up because this is inappropriate in an academic discourse.
Yes.
This is not, I was really not popular in college because I'd get angry, and that was not a book. I'd say there is no literary artistic justification for reading this trash.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it is. This is just I'm sorry, the teachers getting grossly, turned
Yeah.
on by reading perverting young minds.
Yes, exactly. They're spreading their filth. A part of me just wants to giggle because there's another homeschool graduate on the loose calling out when the emperor's buck naked. Come on, people.
Yes.
Wake up.
Well, and I think that most parents are fine with, they'll identify that and say, of course, graphic gay porn. No, nope, not on my watch. But there are a lot more examples today that are insidious. My mom used to joke and say, oh, it was written before the 30s. It's a children's book written before the 30s. It's probably fine. We'll double check, but it's probably fine. So that's when those books where you think this could be all right, this might not be all right, those are the ones really to be attentive to. It's like I said, no one's going to say, here, honey, I got you a witchcraft manual for Christmas. But it's the books that normalize vice or normalize the occult or just present immoral or amoral behavior as okay or not such a big deal. That's when it just gets really, it can be seductive to young minds and it can be sneaky.
Yes, very sneaky. Yeah, I remember the Golden Compass series when it came out, and the author's stated intent was to kill God in the minds of children. And it was literally about someone who needed to, for the good of everyone, literally kill God. It's pretty sick, and they were popular, and well, I won't name too many names, but certain trusted purveyors of children's books were really pushing those things and giving them awards. And
it's dangerous. Well, another one that comes up a lot, you and I discussed this a little bit before, the Harry Potter novels. Now, I have a sort of advantage. When those were released, I was too old to become emotionally attached to them. Some of my brothers read them, and my mother read them with them, and she talked them through it. And there were some challenging themes. Actually, our children haven't read them largely because I'm not emotionally attached to them. And if I'm going to do the work of reading alongside them, I want it to be something I'm into, so I'm interested in. But I know a lot of parents who have read it with their children and have talked it through with their children and have negotiated those themes. So the critical thing there, if you're choosing to read them, notice I'm not going to give you my catalog of reasons why, but if you choose to, read with them. My niece recently, at her school, she had a list of recommended reading for the summer. Good little Catholic school. And one of the books was To Kill a Mockingbird. And she said, oh, that looks short. I'll grab that. So we were all together in the summer, and it was a week where everyone was just, all the families were together. And I looked at her and I said, honey, what are you reading? You look miserable. What are you reading? And she showed me, and I went, oh, how are you doing? And she said, I hate this book. I hate this book. And one of my sisters-in-law was there, and she said, no, you can't hate it. I said, no. She can hate it. She can hate it. This is really tough. And then I went to my brother and I said, do you remember what To Kill a Mockingbird's about? And he said, no. And I was like, let me just run through some plot elements. And he went, I don't know if she knows the facts of life yet. And I said, oh, wow, I think she's about to learn them, and it's going to be really unpleasant. So it was really hard for her and a little traumatic. My brother's like, oh, golly, trying to catch up with. So it can happen that really good parents who are engaged can say, wait, where did you find that book? My husband actually purged a bunch of books that we had left over from college that we could handle, but that we didn't even want in the house, because I don't want my children picking it up and saying, what's this about? I don't think you should be reading that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But so it will come up. And actually, it's a really good thing it does, because your children, you can't protect them for the rest of their lives. And they're going to encounter difficult, seductive, bad, evil ideas. And if they're exposed to them under your roof, where you can still guide them and protect them enough to assist them through the narrative instead of being indoctrinated, that will also help them. I've seen so many young people go to college, and even though they've read voraciously, they encounter the world and they're so shocked that it becomes a spiritual crisis and an intellectual crisis and an emotional crisis. So having a balanced approach to this is critical too. That balanced approach with conversation, so that you are assisting them So like the people I have heard people say, shocked that I teach a Dracula course. Somebody once actually, it was a very sweet homeschooling mom, but she said basically I was teaching children to worship Satan. I said, "Have you read Dracula? Have you read Dracula?" No. Let's slow down a second. Let's actually talk about what's happening in Dracula and why this is a good book to have read. So approaching it without yourself being terrified as parents, that helps too.
Yeah. And we have to learn to kind of trust our judgment on that too. But we're going to take a short sponsor break, everybody. And then I want to hear more from you, Eleanor, about kind of ways that this process, as you said, your daughter comes to you, right? That it can benefit our relationships with our children and set them up to be real thinkers. I want to just take it a little further, and then I want to hear some about your books too. So everybody, we're going to take a quick break to hear from our wonderful sponsors at Homeschool Connections. We're talking with Eleanor Bourg Nicholson about the books your children should never, ever read. Stay with us.
Hi, I'm Walter Crawford.
And I'm Maureen Whitman.
We are the co-founders of homeschoolconnections.com and proud sponsors of the Homeschooling Saints podcast,
which is here to help you homeschool more joyfully, more easily, and more effectively.
We want to thank you for listening.
And we invite you to check out our courses at homeschoolconnections.com.
And now, back to our program.
All right, we're back with Eleanor Bourg Nicholson talking about the books your children should never, ever read. And I just want to notice out loud, as a lot of other moms and grandmothers and parents are probably thinking too, is what a nice bond you have with your kids, that they do come to you, they do trust you, and they do ask you about ideas. So would you mind just saying a little more about what are the fruits that you see?
Oh, they're tremendous, and I really, really value them. Especially because our eldest is only 12 and a half. So working this hard to ensure that she feels, that all of them feel that they can talk to us about anything, even when they've done something we know that they know we will not be pleased, and to talk through moral struggles, because they do have them at that age, and they're pretty significant, especially in their heads. It's very traumatic for them. Our hope is to establish that lasting bond, because I know that the culture and their lives, they're going to be exposed to things that are going to make that conversation harder, especially since there are many homeschool families who've had this experience. If a child chooses something other than what parents would desire, whether that means drifting from the faith, whether that means just taking in a degree of contemporary culture, scare quotes on that word, and just imbibing it in a way that will be intellectually, emotionally, psychologically damaging. Because that does happen. They have free will. But hoping that even if and when that happens, we will have established that, well, I'm not going to condone what you are saying, and I will disagree with you and I'll argue with you, but I still love you. Because that's the message that God wants us to convey. It's how he feels towards us, after all, right?
Yeah. And you're developing not only really rich and sacred human bonds within the family, which is kind of the place where it's meant to happen, right? That's the most important place foundationally where it happens. But you're also cultivating taste. There's something behind that word taste, which means so much more, right? Discernment, appreciation for the good, the true, the beautiful, all of those things, a love of ideas, a love of truth, a love of, being able to talk about things and to have it be in 3 dimensions, not just what we read, but here in our families and in our conversations. Say a little about what happens when something dangerous is introduced, or any place that you'd like to touch into about that.
Well, I think it's something that most of us can we've experienced it in some way. It could even be late at night. Hey, all the children are asleep and I'm doom scrolling. And wait, what's this I just saw? I'm going to go look up this movie that I will never watch to read what it's about. Well, then you read something and say, oh, I don't even want those images in my head. Why would I read that? Why would I? So I think that we can model for our children the very, very, very necessary self-discipline. I said earlier, curiosity is an intellectual vice. And I can remember many years ago, when I was still in college, I reached out to Joseph Pierce, who served as an informal mentor to me from my undergraduate days. I wrote to him and said, I'm in an anti-Catholic neo-Marxist English department. I love what you do. Do you have any advice for, keeping my sanity intact? But so we corresponded for a very long time. And then one day in correspondence or in conversation, I said, I'm going to read Huysmans' La Basse. Huysmans was a very important, high decadent French writer. And I'd read some of his other works. He converted or reverted to Catholicism. Remarkable man. But La Basse, which means the damned, was his autobiographical exploration of the Black Mass. I said, I'm really scared, but I'm going to read this book. And Joseph wrote back and said, don't. He said, you are not called to read this book. The sanctity of your imagination and your intellect is too precious. I have read this book and it disturbed me, and this is not an appropriate thing for you to read. Well, my first reaction was extreme mortification. Like, wow, I guess I'm really weak. But then absolute relief, because I am easily terrified. And I don't want images and things in my head that are going to be traumatic and troubling. So being able to eat the humility, a little bit of humble pie there, and say, I'm not called to read this book. And most people actually aren't. I had a priest friend who was talking about modernist or whatever we are, postmodernist stuff that's out these days. And he said, there's some young priests who say, I'm going to read it so I know what the enemy says and understand his argument. And he said, and most of them are not mature enough. I said, there are very few who can read this without being impacted. There's a quote from George Eliot that I can never remember precisely, but it's something along the lines of, we cannot help but be influenced by what passes through our minds when we read. So modeling for our children that there are some things that you're not called to know, that you don't need to know. It's not, this somehow makes you less, but that you will have peace, greater peace, by protecting your imagination in this way and disciplining your imagination in this way. That can be really valuable, because young people are voracious for knowledge, right? They want their little sponges. And if you teach them to read, they want to read everything in sight. Well, teaching them to be discerning readers and to say, if an idea is presented to you and you can recognize it as dangerous or toxic, or someone whom you trust, even if it's not your parents, says, hold on. You don't need that. And that applies to all sorts of media these days. And there's so much. As I get older, my tolerance for media it decreases really rapidly, because I go, I have so little time. I don't want smut or trash or disturbing images or troubling ideas, because I don't need them. I don't need to prove it to anyone. I don't mind not being hip. I've never been hip in my life. Although I don't think hip's the term anymore. I don't know what the term is.
Isn't it groovy?
That one I recognize. It's like my understanding of popular culture is, I don't know, the 30s. Maybe some of the 60s and 70s. But just being able to parse that. So showing them that, and also showing them that it is not just okay, but it is much healthier, more joyful to be able to say no to whatever the Kool-Aid is today.
Yeah. And I feel like that relates out to so many things: custody of the eyes and temperance and, not eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There are limits to where that curiosity should go. So when I know that I don't want to define it for you, but maybe just say a few more words. When you said curiosity is an intellectual device, obviously curiosity is part of what helps us to know God, right? It makes us want to reach for him, and that's not what you're talking about. Do you mind just saying a few words on that?
It's really, when curiosity is just the desire for knowledge for the sake of having it. So it's just sort of delving into minutia, not because you want to be better informed, but just because, what's that? What's that? oh, what's that? And you go down a rabbit hole. There's a reason Alice in Wonderland says things like curiouser and curiouser. And sometimes that can lead to creativity, that can lead to interesting things, but it's also being able to know, for example, when you accidentally get a book of witchcraft manuals, this is not something that I want you looking into. This is not something that we want to be passed on to anyone else. And we know exorcists. We're just going to ask them and say, in a non-traumatic way, when there's a burn ban in our county, what does one do with these? But to recognize that they have an incredible respect for their father's intellect. We won't go into their mother, but the children, if their father is saying, if daddy's a genius and he's saying, I'm not looking at this, I do not even want these images or words in my head, that's a guiding point for them. But still, I mean, culture's everywhere. This is why I think I've told you before, our computer is in our family room. At this age, they cannot have access to ye internet without an audience, which I think helps as well. Because if you can get alone with a book or get alone with media in a way that you're just sort of, nobody can see what you're doing and seeing, that also becomes an avenue to that curiosity, which will just lead you to go down rabbit holes and read synopses of horror films. And you go, I'm not going to watch this. Why do I need to know what happens in this film? And now I can't sleep because I made a very bad decision. So the temptation to read and imbibe things that will not tend towards virtue or happiness, we all experience it to some degree. And being able to say no to it is true serenity.
Yeah. Amen. And I want to just mention, because we all know, we heard your bio, and people at Homeschool Connections love that you're teaching on Dracula and things like that. Say a little bit about your own books and what it is for you to write Gothic horror.
Well, and this is a place, it's always very good to say, I don't read contemporary horror. I don't watch contemporary horror. I go back to old school Gothic. And mine are very based in a Catholic worldview. There's nothing, there's violence, there's Gothic violence, but there's nothing graphic, nothing that I couldn't read. And my capacity for trauma is very, very low. I mean, I was introduced to the Gothics through Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. I never quite progressed beyond that point. But
another classic.
It's so good, but it scared me so much. It's good for my It's a good example with my children, because until my most recent novel, our two elder girls had not read those books because they weren't ready for them. They did read Wake of Malice, which has a very strong mystery thread. And they both made it through, and they both enjoyed it very much. And then the eldest said, may I read Brother Wolf? So reading them backwards. I'm big into proper chronology, but in this instance, I said, yes, you may. So that one was actually a little scarier, which I thought was very interesting. And we had a lot of conversations about it. And she said, I'm not ready to read A Bloody Habit. And I said, I'm not ready for you to read A Bloody Habit because you have to read Dracula first. And I don't think you're ready for Dracula. And she agreed. And we continued to talk about the books that she had read, which was so amazing to have my children entering into this imaginative world that I created. It was so much fun. But also, at no point, and I told them this, is I don't like giving away plot points, but at no point do I want you haunted by nightmares. If it bothers you, you come talk to me. And we'll set it aside. This is not worth nightmares.
Right.
So that one of the reasons that they're able to read what I write, even to that small extent, is because of that trusting relationship we've established, right? And that I know how much they've read, and I know what their capacity is, and I know what they're going to pick up on. There were themes that totally went over the 10-year-old's head, which was awesome because I intended them to go over her head. But the almost 13-year-old, she is coming to me and saying, well, Mommy, let's talk. And that's appropriate too. They did the same thing with David Copperfield. It was like, wait a second, I know what that means. So that trusting relationship in the conversation, but also not pushing them one way or the other, so that they knew that I was not going to break down crying if they said, I'm disturbed, I don't want to read anymore. But I would have been very upset if they had continued to read something that was upsetting them to try and please me in some way. No, it is sort of funny to be the writer of Gothic novels in a Catholic circle, because some of the Catholics sort of recoil a little bit. And the non-Catholics recoil because of all the Catholicism. So it's like, I'm being recoiled. People are recoiling from it. But I had somebody stop me at church the other day and said, I got your new book. I'm really excited to read it, but I just wish you'd write a love story. I said, there's a love story in there. She said, no, just a straight love story. I said, I don't think that's possible. I don't think I can do that. So yeah, really the thing we keep going back to is conversation and guidance, whether even when you try to your utmost to protect them, you don't know what they're going to pick up in the end, and you can't fully protect them. And again, thank heaven for that, because you also want to be there for those conversations. And if you can have those conversations at nearly 13, we pray that they'll come back at 18 to talk to you again, or 20 or 25, or in my case, early 40s, calling my mom and saying, hey, I just read this and this is actually disturbing me. Let's talk this through. It's still, or calling my husband and saying, hey, this came up. I don't know how to answer this. I'm really disturbed by it. It's either something I read or something, the children overheard or saw, or somebody told them about this, or so-and-so gave us this book for the children. How are we going to negotiate this? And if he always knows the answer, but if he didn't, turning to the next authority and saying, all right, let's seek someone who can advise us here. So it's recognizing that those relationships and those conversations that you as an adult are having are going to help you with the conversations that your children bring to the forefront.
So if you wouldn't mind, Eleanor, with the time that we have left, I'd like everyone to just hear a little bit about the courses that you teach at Homeschool Connections as well.
Well, thank you. So I teach primarily Victorian and some genre studies. I'll be teaching in the spring of 2025 a 6-week course on Nicholas Nickleby, which I think is a great introduction for Dickens for young people. And then I'll also teach a 6-week course on George Eliot's Middlemarch. That one's a little heftier, so it's probably better for more experienced readers. But it's well worth the work. It's harder work, but it's worth the work. And then I have a wide range of recorded courses available. Like I said, mostly Victorian, but I've strayed into the 20th century a few times with things like my 2-semester detective fiction course. I've got a 2-semester Jane Austen course where we read everything Jane Austen.
Nice.
It's so much fun. And the students, I love the students. It's one of my joys of the week to log into that class. It's always an honor to be guiding them in reading and hopefully continuing to nurture a love of literature that parents have instilled in them.
Yeah, and getting lots of great reviews too. So, a very beloved teacher here. What would you like to leave our listeners with as we're closing up?
Really just thank you for all you do with your children. You're doing an incredible job. You're doing a grace-filled job. And don't be afraid. Anxiety it plagues all of us. It's a very anxious time. But recognizing that God gave them to us and we are giving them back to God, they're in His hands. And all we can do through His grace is the best that we can do, which I see parents doing all the time. So say thanks be to God, but also thanks be to all these good parents for the work they're doing and the conversations, the hard work they're doing, but also the joy-filled work. I had a priest friend say, there's a spectrum of consolation in raising children. When they're little, they're so cute. They're not very interesting. When they reach high school age, they're not cute, but they're starting to be interesting. Yeah. And you have the potential for friendship, Christian friendship with your own offspring. And I'm watching that with our children, and it's a real joy. So I hope you all have a moment to let go of anxiety and to embrace that joy.
Such good advice. Thank you so much, Eleanor Bourg Nicholson. And you can find Eleanor at her website, eleanorbourgnicholson.com. I also have a link in the show notes for Eleanor's courses and more about her books and all of that. And her husband, Sam, is on that page too. Eleanor, thanks so much for being with us. We know it's a very busy time in your life, but as always, a great, great conversation.
Thank you, Lisa. It's always a blast.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today. We appreciate you and we pray for you. Please pray for us too. God bless you. Have a great day. And that's our show for today. Our program is sponsored by homeschoolconnections.com. Be sure to subscribe to Homeschooling Saints and leave us an honest review. God bless you and thank you for joining us.